The champagne hadn't even been poured when my brother-in-law looked across the table and said, "We're going to have to let you go." Not quietly, not privately. In front of 40 people, at a table set with linen napkins and engraved place cards. At the celebration dinner my sister had insisted I attend. The dinner to mark her first official week as president of Callaway and Reed Interiors, the firm our grandmother had started in a converted garage in Tucson 40 years ago. I was the one who had turned it into what it was now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My grandmother, who everyone called Gran, built her business the way she built everything. Slowly, carefully, without asking permission. She died when I was 22 and left the company to my mother, with the understanding that it would pass to whoever had the clearest vision for it. That was what her attorney told us. Whoever has the clearest vision, not whoever is oldest, not whoever shares the last name. Whoever can see where it needs to go. My sister was 34 and had worked in PR for a hotel chain. I was 29 and had spent 7 years inside the business, first as Gran's assistant, then restructuring the vendor contracts, then quietly rebuilding the client acquisition model after a bad fiscal year nearly swallowed us. My mother ran operations but had always leaned on me to be the one who actually solved things. When Gran died, my sister came back from Phoenix and started attending meetings. I didn't say anything. She had a right to be there. It was her family, too. But then she started redecorating her old bedroom at the house where my mother still lived. Then she started attending client lunches without telling me. Then one afternoon, I came back from a site visit and found my name had been removed from the company's email signature template, the one that went out to all new inquiries, and my sister's name had replaced it. I mentioned it to my mother that evening. She said, "She just wants to contribute. You know how she is." I said I understood. I set my coffee down and didn't finish it. I went home and opened my laptop and worked until 2 in the morning on a refinancing proposal that would free up capital for the studio expansion we'd been planning for 3 years. My brother-in-law, the one who would later fire me at a dinner table in front of 40 people, was a real estate attorney. My sister had married him 2 years earlier. He had dark, even features, and the kind of handshake that told you he'd practiced it. He started coming to meetings that fall, always sitting just off to the side, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I asked my mother why he was there, she said he was just helping with the legal side of some transitional questions. I asked what transitional questions. She said, just the structure. It's getting complicated. I said I'd been handling the structure for years. She said she knew that. She touched my arm. She didn't say anything else. In November, my sister hosted a dinner at her house, the new one she and my brother-in-law had bought in Scottsdale, with the terracotta floors and the outdoor fireplace they used 3 nights a year. My mother was there, a few family friends, the firm's longest-standing client, a woman named Mrs. Alcott, who had used Callaway and Reed for every renovation she'd undertaken in 40 years, and 2 men I didn't recognize who turned out to be from a private equity group my brother-in-law had apparently been meeting with for months. That was the night I understood what was happening, not because anyone told me, because I had spent enough years watching the business from the inside to recognize a positioning meeting when I was sitting in one. The 2 men from the equity group barely spoke to me. They spoke to my sister and to my brother-in-law, and once to my mother, who smiled pleasantly and said the company was in wonderful hands and had such an exciting future. I sat across the table from Mrs. Alcott, who leaned in at one point and whispered, "Are you all right?" I told her I was fine. She looked at me for a moment longer than felt comfortable and then turned back to her wine. I drove home that night on the 101, windows down, the desert air doing that thing it does in November where it can't decide if it's warm or cold. I thought about Gran. I thought about the afternoon she'd handed me a stack of vendor contracts and said, "Find where we're bleeding." I'd been 23. I'd found 4 places. She'd laughed and said, "I knew it." I thought about the way she always signed documents at the kitchen table, reading every line, her pen moving slowly and deliberately, like she believed each signature was a small promise. My sister and my brother-in-law did not read documents the way Gran did. That was the thing I had been quietly counting on. I had been with the company long enough to know exactly which documents had been signed in a hurry and which ones still held. There is a clause in our operating agreement, inserted during a governance overhaul I had managed 4 years earlier when we'd restructured after a minor legal dispute with a former partner, that addresses decision-making authority for equity holders. I had drafted the relevant language myself, in consultation with an outside attorney my grandmother had trusted, a quiet man named Mr. Osei, who worked out of a small office in downtown Tucson and returned every phone call within the hour. The clause was not hidden. It was not complicated. It was written clearly on page 11 of a 42-page document that my mother had signed at her kitchen table while my sister was on the phone in the next room and my brother-in-law was parking the car. It said simply that any shareholder holding more than 30% of equity in the company retained veto authority over structural personnel decisions, including executive appointments, involuntary terminations of other equity holders, and ownership transfers. My sister held 20%. My brother-in-law held none. I held 38%. I had asked for equity instead of salary increases 4 times over 7 years. Twice, my mother had agreed while distracted, once while watching something on her tablet, once while on a call with her sister in New Mexico. She'd signed the transfer paperwork each time without my sister in the room. I hadn't hidden it. There was nothing to hide. I just hadn't made a point of mentioning it at family dinners. In January, my sister was formally appointed president. There was an announcement sent to clients. There was a small gathering at the studio, catered, with a cake that said "New Chapter" in script frosting. My name appeared in the announcement as founding team member, which was the kind of phrase that meant everything and nothing at the same time. I stood near the window at that gathering and watched my mother look proud and my sister pose for photos and my brother-in-law work the room with his practiced handshake. Mrs. Alcott found me by the window and stood next to me for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "You built this place." I said, "Gran built it." Mrs. Alcott said, "Gran built the foundation. You built the house." Then she took her sparkling water and walked away. The celebration dinner was 3 weeks later, 40 people. The good restaurant, the one in North Scottsdale with the stone fireplace and the kind of acoustics that carry sound farther than anyone intends. I had been seated at the far end of the second table, not at my sister's table, not with my mother, at a table with 2 clients I'd brought in myself, a vendor, a former colleague of my brother-in-law's, and 2 people I had never met who turned out to be his law school friends. I had just set my napkin in my lap when my brother-in-law stood and clinked a glass and gave a short speech about vision and legacy and the exciting new direction for the firm. He said my sister's name 3 times. He said my mother's name once. He said mine not at all. Then he sat down, looked directly at me, and said, quietly enough that only the people immediately around us could hear, "We've been meaning to talk to you about your role going forward. We think it's time to transition you out. We can make it clean. We appreciate everything you've done." The table nearest us went silent. My mother, 2 tables away, was laughing at something someone had said and hadn't heard. I set my fork down. I took a breath through my nose, even and slow. I looked at my brother-in-law's face, which was arranged into something meant to look regretful, and at my sister's face, which was not quite meeting my eyes. I said, "Tell my sister the equity committee will need to convene. I'll send the notice tonight." Then I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and walked out. The parking lot was cold for January in Scottsdale, which meant it was maybe 55 degrees, and the sky was completely clear, the kind of clear you only get in the desert when there's nothing between you and the dark. I sat in my car for a moment with my hands in my lap, not shaking, not crying, just sitting. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I had known it was coming for long enough that the plan had already been made. All I had to do was execute it. I drove home. I did not change clothes. I sat down at my desk, and I opened my laptop. The first thing I did was email Mr. Osei. Was 67 years old and semi-retired and responded to emails at unusual hours because, as he had once told me, he'd never been able to sleep past 4 in the morning. I attached the relevant sections of the operating agreement and wrote 3 sentences. He responded in 11 minutes. Clause holds. Call me at 8. The second they did was pull up the equity registry I had maintained since the restructure. I kept it in a shared drive that only I had ever thought to check. Every transfer, every signature, every date. Attached to each entry was the signed document, scanned, time-stamped, filed. My 38% had never been in dispute. It had simply never been mentioned. The third thing I did was draft the formal equity committee notice. Under the operating agreement, an equity holder with more than 35% could call a governance meeting with 72 hours' notice. I sent it to the registered agent, to Mr. Osei, to the 2 independent advisors we'd brought on during the restructure, and, as required, to my sister and my mother. Then I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. My mother called at 7:15 in the morning. I let it go to voicemail. My sister called at 7:42. Same. My brother-in-law sent an email with the subject line, "Let's resolve this," at 8:03. I read it, noted the word resolve, and closed it. At 8 o'clock, I called Mr. Osei. We talked for 40 minutes. He used the word unambiguous 4 times. I appreciated that about him. The governance meeting was held 72 hours later, in a conference room at a neutral attorney's office in Central Phoenix. My sister arrived with my brother-in-law and a lawyer from his firm. My mother arrived separately, looking small in a large wool coat, and sat down without making eye contact with anyone. I arrived with Mr. Osei, who wore the same navy suit he seemed to own in multiples, and a single folder. The meeting was not dramatic. It was almost quiet. Mr. Osei walked through the operating agreement, section by section. He explained the equity distribution. He explained the clause. He explained what had been triggered at the restaurant and what that meant procedurally. My brother-in-law's attorney asked 3 questions, each of which Mr. Osei answered by pointing to a specific page and reading the relevant sentence aloud. At one point, my sister said, "She never told us she had that much equity." Mr. Osei said, "The transfers were documented and filed each time they occurred. Would you like to review the dates?" She would not. My mother looked at the table for most of the meeting. Once she looked up at me. Her expression was not angry. It was something I didn't have a clean word for. Not quite grief, not quite recognition, something partway between. I looked back at her and waited. She looked down again. The meeting concluded with a formal record of the equity structure, a notation that the executive appointment process had not been conducted in compliance with the operating agreement, and a 30-day corrective period during which operational authority would revert to the majority equity holder pending resolution. That was me. My brother-in-law asked, walking out, if I was happy now. I said I was interested in the company being stable. That was what I'd always been interested in. He didn't respond to that. My sister tried once more, in the parking garage, just the 2 of us near the stairwell. She said I could have just talked to them. I said I had been trying to talk to them for 14 months, in a dozen different rooms, and no one had wanted to listen. She said that wasn't fair. I said the operating agreement didn't really have a fairness clause. She walked to her car without saying anything else. That was fine. Some conversations are the last one in a long series, not the beginning of anything new. It took about 2 months to stabilize the firm properly. Mrs. Alcott, when I called her, said, "I was wondering when you'd get around to this." She sounded pleased in the measured way of someone who had been expecting a phone call for a while. The 2 clients from my table at the dinner were both still under contract. The vendor reached out within the week to confirm the relationship would continue. The private equity conversations my brother-in-law had started went nowhere. Without his involvement in the governance structure, and without my sister's unchecked authority, there was nothing to sell to anyone. My mother and I had dinner in March. She drove out to Scottsdale. We sat at a small table near the window at a place we'd gone together for years. She ordered the same thing she always ordered. We talked about Gran for a while. She said she thought I was angry. I said I wasn't angry. She said she should have paid more attention. I said that was probably true, but that I didn't need her to say it. We sat with that for a while. She asked if she still had a role in the company. I told her yes, of course. The same role she'd always had. That hadn't changed. She looked relieved in a way that was almost hard to look at, like she had been bracing for something I hadn't been planning to do. I realized then that she had expected retaliation. She'd been waiting for me to be the kind of person she'd maybe been afraid I was becoming. I wasn't that person. I had never wanted to burn anything down. I just wanted the structure to hold. When it didn't hold on its own, I made it hold. Gran used to say that the difference between a good contract and a bad one wasn't the language. It was whether the people signing it believed they'd ever have to rely on it. The ones who thought they'd never need it signed fast and forgot faster. The ones who might need it someday, they read every line. I had always read every line. My sister eventually moved back to Phoenix and started a boutique consulting practice. My brother-in-law went back to real estate law. As far as I know, they're fine. We don't speak often. When we do, it's careful and civil, the way conversations are when people have agreed, without saying so, to let things be what they are. The company is doing well. We opened the studio expansion last fall, the one I'd been planning for 3 years before any of this happened. The ribbon cutting was quiet. Just the staff, Mrs. Alcott, Mr. O.C., and my mother, who stood near the door and looked around the room like she was trying to memorize it. Someone took a photo. In it, I'm laughing at something, Mrs. Alcott said, and my mother has her hand on my arm, and the room behind us is full of the kind of light that only comes through west-facing windows in late afternoon. I keep it on my desk, not as a reminder of what I won, as a reminder of what held. Power doesn't live in announcements or titles or dinner speeches. It lives in the agreements people sign without reading, in the equity transfers they approve during commercial breaks, in the documents that sit quietly in a shared drive for 7 years until the moment they're needed. They built something they thought was theirs. They just didn't read the part that said otherwise.